Oceana is the largest international organization that is dedicated exclusively to protecting the world's oceans. So we have offices in 12 countries and continue to expand. You can see Monterey is our main California office, so we're definitely lucky to be here. And we have campaigns is kind of the way that we try to run the organization, 3 to 5 year campaigns, focusing on overfishing, reducing bycatch, protecting habitat, increasing transparency in how we use the ocean, and curbing pollution. Our motto is, save the oceans and feed the world. So how can we be smarter about how we treat the oceans and do it in a way that allows the oceans to continue to sustain us and the many, billions of people that depend on the oceans for seafood and their livelihoods. In terms of the approach that we use, we kind of use a combination of, science, law, grassroots organizing, strategic communications, and then advocacy. The California current, in terms of some of the just spectacular ecosystems, and it's just an amazing place for migratory species that come here from across the oceans to largely, in many cases, to feed on the rich abundance of forage fish and productivity that we have here off the ocean. And every day, as some of you may know, there's also sort of a large migration that happens where large amounts of biomass of ocean life basically migrates up and down in the water column throughout the day. And so gill nets is a way of fishing that actually takes advantage of this and basically says, well, let's put big nets that are going to catch all these large feeder, migratory species at the surface, because that's going to be a really efficient way to catch some of these predators, particularly like swordfish and sharks that they're going after, and large tunas. But unfortunately, as you might imagine, you're essentially putting these nets up where the entire food chain is congregated to eat. And so there's a lot of other types of species that are caught as well. So the National Marine Fisheries Service puts observers on fishing boats, and basically they count everything that's caught and what's thrown back. And based on the data that's been collected over decades, the fishery throws back over 63% of everything it catches. Many of this is dead or dying. This includes a lot of different marine mammals in particular, over 70 species overall. And some of these are endangered species that are very vulnerable populations. And there's also just the problem of wasting that much life in the pursuit of the target species of swordfish. Gray whales are large migrators, but they basically are no match for a drift gill net and get tangled and most frequently don't make it and survive through these nets. Dolphins, here are extremely social animals. They get caught in these nets. And so we spent a lot of years trying to kind of defend existing regulations, working on things like leatherback conservation areas and closed areas. But ultimately, despite these regulations that were put in place, the fishermen continued to fight back on them. There was efforts to dismantle them, pretty much every year, and there was basically still too much bycatch. And even though fishermen are required to self-report all of their bycatch of marine mammals, that is happening maybe 2% of the time. And the question was, we're not going to just simply ban this gear and put these fishermen out of business. We have to find a way to keep fishing swordfish, but can we do that without the bycatch? If you look at swordfish, daily migrations, it actually follows that pattern that I showed earlier at the beginning, where during the nighttime, they're feeding at the surface, but during the day, they go deep beneath the thermocline. This is, down around 300 meters of depth or around 1,000 feet. The other animals are not feeding this area. The idea is you could largely catch nothing but swordfish. And that's essentially exactly what led to this idea of deep set buoy gear, a new innovative method for catching swordfish. That instead of using a drift gill net at night, it's fishing during the daytime when the swordfish are at depth. And so they were able to catch only 2% bycatch, and they're able to fish the gear actively. So anything that they catch that's not a swordfish that they don't want to keep, they can basically just kind of catch and release and pull them right off the hook and let them go without ever pulling them out of the water. With this fund, the state would basically phase out its permits and pay fishermen, $110,000 a piece per active fisherman to move over to this new deep set buoy gear and actually surrender their nets and permits. And if they didn't choose to participate and receive the funds, they could fish a few more years, but then they would actually have to stop 4 years from the date of the program starting. So the question was then, it didn't actually automatically phase the fishery out. We had to raise the money. And no one had really kind of thought about doing this before. So Oceana kind of figured out, can we create our own transition fund where we can receive money, and rather than keeping it for ourselves, actually donate that money and make sure it all goes into the state program to activate this legislation. What that means is that over 50 miles of these drift gill nets are now forever out in the ocean. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the story, because some of the drift gill net fishermen that didn't want to participate actually sued the state and said you can't prohibit this fishery because it's federally permitted. And California was worried about that lawsuit and basically declared it's not going to stop those guys from fishing. And so what this meant was there were still 25 federal permit holders, including 9 of them that were still actively fishing, that remained on the water. And the only solution was to actually go and change federal law. Ultimately, on December 29th of 2022, we got a bill that actually phases out permanently all drift gill nets out of all waters in the entire United States. Since this was the last fishery that still used it, it's now a national ban. They basically get 5 years from the date of signing this. So December 29th, 2027 will be the last drift gill nets. And just recently, this got some news here locally on September 15th. The National Marine Fisheries Service issued the first 50 federal deep set buoy gear permits. And the first people in line were basically those who innovated and pioneered the new gear, as well as all those fishermen who participated in the drift gill net transition program that turned in all their nets and basically became first in line to get these new deep set buoy gear permits. So now I'll shift gears a little bit and talk about preventing entanglements and innovating whale-safe pop-up gear in the California Dungeness crab fishery. So there are actually over a half a dozen species that do get entangled in the lines that connect the traps to the buoys at the seafloor. There's 3 key species that are endangered: Pacific leatherback sea turtles, the Central American population of humpback whales, and North Pacific blue whales. So basically what happens is there's a trap that's at the bottom. That's how they catch the crabs, with these baited traps. The crabs go in, they can't come out unless they're under a certain size, and they can escape. But then this line that connects the trap up to the buoys at the surface is where the whales often get tangled up, and they can get it in their mouths and get it around their fins, their flukes. And unfortunately, because after these entanglements, if you can imagine, it's basically like a ball and chain, ultimately can prevent them from being able to feed, slows them down, can actually sever appendages, and that's why it can be so harmful to these species. So there's whale entanglement teams that are out there trying to disentangle these whales. A small percentage of them are successfully disentangled. Due to a number of factors, like particularly climate change and warming water, that's actually compressed the whale's habitat into smaller nearshore areas where all the food is. So they have a smaller area they can feed in. That area has caused that overlap of fishing grounds and the whale feeding areas has resulted in the last 10 years in a real spike, particularly with the humpback whales, in confirmed West Coast whale entanglements. So between ship strikes that are also hurting these whales and entanglements, the federal government now acknowledges that we're exceeding that threshold of population impacts by 4-fold. Right now, we've kind of transitioned to thinking about when the fishery can be open and when it can be closed in certain areas, so that we could still have a fishery, but not catch the whales. But alternative fishing gear, such as pop-up fishing gear, can be used in areas closed to conventional gear. So we're basically figuring out when areas need to be closed to those vertical lines so that whales can safely travel and feed in these areas without the risk of entanglement when they're here, but then have the fishery open when the whales have gone on their migration annually. The last thing is I want to talk about is pop-up gear. Basic idea here is that you're fishing traps, but you're not leaving a vertical line just sitting there in the water. The vertical line that you're going to use to retrieve it and pull the trap up, since it's not just going to float up on its own, there's basically some sort of a buoyant buoy system that stays with the trap and then is triggered when the fisherman comes back, that basically then they come up to the surface and the fisherman's able to retrieve them. And so there's not vertical lines in the water while they're fishing, only when they're retrieving the gear. And so now we're moving past that, as the gear's now been shown to be reliable and the fishermen are starting to like it. Let's do a full-scale experimental fishing permit, or EFP, where you're fishing at a commercial scale. You're actually having enforcement try out, finding the gear with that new technology. You're even putting multiple traps per line together to improve fishing efficiency. And then the idea is that once you can demonstrate it at that scale, the following year, we could actually get it authorized. So not just the people doing an experimental permit can do it, but any fisherman could actually fish this during the springtime when the fishery is closed. And once we get to that point, then we'll actually have a model to start exploring the use of this in other fisheries as well.